In the hush after the Great Global War of 1939 to 1945, the Soviet Union stood as the sturdy survivor of immense destruction. Soviet people, returning from years of sacrifice, saw their homeland scarred yet triumphant. Cities lay in ruins, and fields had been trampled by tanks, but Soviet soldiers had raised their flag in victory. At the close of the war, Stalin convened with the leaders of the Western Allies at Yalta and later Potsdam. These were solemn gatherings in a Europe still stained by conflict. At each conference, Stalin insisted on strict security measures for the Soviet Union. He demanded that the governments of neighboring countries be friendly to the USSR, believing that only loyal communist states could prevent future invasions. The Western leaders understood too well that Stalin had in mind both Poland and Hungary, and they insisted on promises of free elections. Truman and Churchill reluctantly agreed to some form of compromise, hoping that cooperation could continue despite their worries. Stalin was certain. The Red Army's sacrifices had been the great bulwark of victory, and no matter what reasons the Allies gave, the Soviet people deserved guarantees for the future. Stalin often cited history to justify his stance. After two devastating invasions by Napoleon and Hitler, he argued the Soviet Union would never again let foreign troops march on its soil. In later meetings, such as at Potsdam in July 1945, Stalin's tough stance continued. He negotiated fiercely, insisting on heavy reparations from Germany to pay for Soviet reconstruction. He left Potsdam with millions of tons of German equipment and industrial machinery loaded onto Soviet trains, contributing greatly to rebuilding the USSR's damaged economy. All the while, Moscow kept troops in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union would not soon let go of its new influence there. Almost overnight, the Soviet Union extended its grip across Eastern Europe. Communist parties took power in Poland, Romania, Hungary, and other liberated lands, each with clear Soviet backing. The elections that followed were heavily managed so that socialist candidates won by large margins. Within a few years, new socialist governments were also established in East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Even Yugoslavia became communist-led. Stalin expected all these countries to follow Moscow's direction, and relations frayed when Yugoslav leader Tito asserted his country's independence. In 1948, Stalin broke with Tito, accusing him of nationalist deviation and cutting ties. The Soviets expelled Yugoslavia from the Communist Information Bureau, known as the Cominform, isolating it from the other socialist states. In 1947, Stalin had organized the Cominform to bind communist parties together across Europe. In theory, it was meant to help socialist states cooperate. In practice, however, many Eastern Europeans and Soviet citizens alike saw Cominform as enforcing Moscow's will. The Bureau's real purpose was to ensure loyalty to Soviet policy rather than to encourage open partnership. By 1948, the Soviet Union had effectively turned all of Eastern Europe into a buffer zone of friendly states. The Cold War had begun, marked by an iron curtain descending from the Baltic to the Adriatic, as Churchill would later put it, though in Soviet eyes it was merely a line drawn to keep out future invaders. When the United States announced the Marshall Plan in 1947, offering vast aid to rebuild Western Europe, the Soviets responded with deep suspicion. Stalin forbade any Eastern Bloc country from participating, denouncing the plan as a capitalist scheme to undermine socialism. Instead, the Soviet Union set up its own economic organization in 1949, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon. It invited its socialist neighbors to pool resources under centralized planning. Soviet leaders claimed this was a fair exchange among friends, but to many people it appeared to be a method to keep Eastern Europe economically tied to the USSR. By isolating itself from Western aid, the socialist bloc cut itself off from booming markets and technologies. Instead of a unified Europe, trade now followed two lines, one within the communist countries and one for the West. Soviet propaganda proclaimed this division as proof that socialism and capitalism were irreconcilable. Meanwhile, Stalin continued to demand heavy reparations from Germany to help rebuild the USSR, asserting that the capitalist powers should recognize Soviet sacrifice. One of the first crises of the Cold War erupted in the heart of Germany, in the city of Berlin. By 1948, West Germany had introduced a new currency and begun rebuilding its economy. Stalin believed this would damage the Soviet zone economically. On June 24, 1948, he ordered a blockade of all road, rail, and canal access to the western sectors of Berlin. Soviet troops stopped trains and closed highways leading to the city. The official Soviet justification was that the Western introduction of the Deutsche Mark violated earlier agreements, and that the blockade would force the Allies to renegotiate the post-war settlement. Western leaders refused to back down and instead responded with a massive airlift. For nearly a year, cargo planes flew food, coal, and medicine into the blockaded city, landing nearly every minute at peak. Soviet fighters occasionally buzzed the Allied planes, but they did not shoot them down. A direct battle could have escalated disastrously. By May 1949, Stalin lifted the blockade. Though many Berliners had suffered under the siege, the Soviet leadership claimed publicly that it had simply tested the Allies' resolve. In reality, the blockade convinced Stalin that Germany would remain split into two separate states. By late 1949, the Soviet occupation zone was officially declared the German Democratic Republic under Walter Ulbricht, a loyal communist. East Germans were told that this socialist republic would end the instability of occupation. In exchange, West Germany became the Federal Republic under the Western Allies. Berlin remained a divided city for decades to come. Meanwhile, life inside the Soviet Union continued under the strictures of state planning and ideology. Factories, having converted from wartime production, began to make tractors, steel, and other industrial goods to rebuild the nation. The government launched 5-year plans aiming to develop the vast resources of the homeland. In homes, however, many people still faced shortages. Housing had been badly damaged during the war, and millions lived in crowded communal apartments or simple wooden houses. Parents often shared tiny rooms with their children, and neighbors shared kitchens and toilets. Basic goods like soap, clothing, and shoes were often in short supply. Public order under the party meant that in return, the state guaranteed jobs, free education, and basic health care for all citizens. Children attended government schools where they learned about the recent war and the ideals of Marx and Lenin. Young pioneers and Komsomol youth organizations organized parades on Soviet holidays, instilling discipline and pride. The Soviet press and radio praised every collective farm harvest and every factory output quota met, giving citizens a sense of collective purpose. Every Victory Day on May 9th, grand parades and ceremonies honored war veterans and the Red Army, reinforcing pride in the Soviet triumph. It was a world of guarantees and scarcity, of public triumph and quiet hardship. By 1949, another milestone occurred. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. This achievement had been kept secret until the moment of explosion, catching the Western powers by surprise. Soviet officials announced the news calmly, as if reporting a successful harvest. For the people, it was a moment of great pride and relief. The USSR had ended America's nuclear monopoly. That era of exclusive American power was over. In 1950, just as the Americans developed a hydrogen bomb, Soviet scientists worked frantically to keep pace. In August 1953, barely weeks after Stalin's own death, the USSR proudly announced it had detonated a thermonuclear bomb. Soviet newspapers reported that science had succeeded once again. This achievement reassured many people that the Cold War was more balanced now. No single country could strike without fear of devastating retaliation. Young Soviet cadets were taught that this nuclear arsenal created a stalemate of terror. In effect, each superpower now held the other back from aggression. Meanwhile, a communist revolution swept Asia. In 1949, after a long civil war, Mao Zedong's forces finally won control of mainland China and declared the People's Republic of China. The Soviet leadership hailed China's victory as a historic success for socialism. Stalin and Mao signed mutual aid treaties. Soviet engineers helped build Chinese factories and railways, and both nations declared an era of socialist friendship. The Kremlin proclaimed that a new friendship of peoples had been forged. Soviet newspapers ran images of Stalin and Mao smiling with clasped hands. Ordinary Soviet citizens felt a mixture of pride and curiosity, pride that socialism was spreading in the world's most populous country, and curiosity about Chinese culture and customs. Propaganda posters portrayed China's long history joining the Soviet family and celebrated the idea that a socialist giant now stood on the world stage. Behind the scenes, Soviet planners quietly noted that a Soviet-Chinese alliance could change the balance of power in East Asia. By 1950, the world was clearly divided into two blocs. The United States had formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military pact among Western democracies, and the Soviets responded by emphasizing their own defensive alliances. Warsaw Pact military exercises between the USSR and its Eastern European allies began to take shape. In Soviet classrooms, students learned that the war had become ideological, democracy and capitalism on one side versus proletarian socialism on the other. Each side warned that the other aimed to conquer the world or sabotage peace. Soviet propaganda portrayed America as imperialist and aggressive. Western capitalism was depicted as a society on the brink of collapse, full of inequality and hatred. Against this backdrop, ordinary people lived with the sense that tension between East and West was permanent. One of the greatest dramas unfolded on the Korean Peninsula in the early 1950s. In June 1950, North Korean forces invaded the South, aiming to reunify the country under communism. Stalin had quietly given permission to Kim Il-sung's plan, viewing it as an opportunity to expand socialism in Asia and to draw American attention away from Europe. When American and United Nations forces intervened to support South Korea, the war became bloody and brutal. The Soviet Union itself remained behind the scenes. It did not send its own troops openly, but provided crucial support. Soviet pilots secretly flew MiG fighter jets in Korean skies, and Soviet anti-aircraft crews assisted the North. The USSR also provided weapons, tanks, and advisors to the North Koreans. In late 1950, the Chinese Red Army entered the conflict on Kim's side, as Stalin had anticipated, further tying down American forces. By 1953, the war was at a bloody stalemate. An armistice was signed in July 1953, essentially restoring the original border. Soviet media portrayed the outcome as a victory of communist determination. Our comrades held firm against imperialist aggression, they declared. The Koreans' shared hardship was commemorated in speeches, and Soviet people were told the fight had served a higher purpose. It had delayed the Americans and secured another socialist state. Within the Soviet Union itself, these years remained dominated by Stalin's strong hand. The Communist Party spread the message that capitalism was dying of its own contradictions, and that the Soviet model was the future. Newspapers and radio loudly broadcast the Soviet official line. The USSR was building a perfect, classless society, while Western countries were depicted as criminal, decadent, and on the brink of war. Posters in factories and schools condemned Western imperialism and the excesses of capitalism. Any Soviet who showed too much interest in forbidden foreign music or dissenting ideas risked attracting the attention of the secret police. Thousands of people accused of political crimes languished in labor camps, often for years. Despite this, ordinary life went on beneath these grand events. Factories pushed workers to achieve planned quotas. Farmers toiled in collective fields. Children did their homework by kerosene lamp in rural huts, or by electric light in better-off apartments. A common slogan was, "Give us more," as everyone felt the pressure to produce on the job and sacrifices at home, yet most people took some comfort in the order of daily life. The state provided schooling and ensured that children had shoes, even if they were worn. Health care and job security meant that families could plan their lives. Hospitals, free to all, brought basic cures even in remote provinces. There were also official outlets for pride. Veterans of the Great Patriotic War were celebrated as heroes for decades. Each victory or new factory brought a wave of praise. Names on the Hero of Socialist Labor certificate, paintings in the People's Art Hall, a mention in the local newspaper. In this way, people found meaning amid hardship. Then, in the spring of 1953, sudden news brought shock to the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin had died of a stroke. Across the vast land, people went into deep mourning. A heavy silence fell over Moscow and Leningrad. Workers held impromptu vigils at their workplaces. Families wept quietly. At home, All radio broadcasts switched abruptly to solemn tributes for Stalin's life. For days, Soviet media promised that Stalin's spirit would continue to guide the nation. A huge funeral procession marched through the streets of Moscow. Tens of thousands of soldiers carried the coffin into Red Square beneath a gray sky. It was a moment of finality for many. The man who had led them for decades was gone. In the days that followed, the new leaders repeated Stalin's slogans and called for unity, promising that the dream of socialism would not die with Stalin. But among ordinary people, a quiet mix of relief and uncertainty began to stir. In small ways, life started to change. After Stalin's death, a power struggle ensued among the Communist Party elders. In the end, Nikita Khrushchev emerged as the leading figure, with Georgy Malenkov briefly as premier. Khrushchev was energetic, blunt, and born in the Ukrainian countryside. He promised to end the terror of the past and allowed some private criticism of officials. Within a few months, Khrushchev declared that the Soviet people had endured too much fear and suffering. Families quietly tore down some pictures of Stalin in their homes. Khrushchev spoke of peaceful coexistence with the West and hinted that the future could be more open. Newspapers stopped referring to Stalin as an infallible genius. People gained hope that the endless purges of the 1930s had ended. In schools, teachers still praised socialist achievements, but many began to emphasize progress and peace instead of constant fear of war. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev gradually became the new leader of the Soviet Union. He asserted that the USSR would no longer provoke wars, but instead would defend socialism peacefully. Many people took comfort in his words. In the first months, a cautious optimism spread among the population. Factories began to produce some new consumer goods, and the standard of living slowly rose. More schools and kindergartens were built, and farmers were allowed to keep kitchen gardens to grow extra food. Even so, Khrushchev made clear he still supported the Soviet system firmly. He insisted that socialism would eventually outlast capitalism by its own merits, and that they must continue to build a strong economy and military to ensure it. In 1956, Khrushchev shocked both the world and many Soviets with what was called the secret speech. In a closed party congress, he denounced Stalin's abuses, calling Stalin a tyrant who had betrayed the revolution. This speech was kept inside the party at first, but word of it spread. For the first time, Soviet media and some publications acknowledged that grave crimes had been committed in the 1930s. This quietly initiated what became known as the thaw. Afterward, censorship was eased in some areas. A few political prisoners were released, and the party admitted mistakes had been made. New books and films appeared that had been banned before. Ordinary people cautiously tested the limits. Some attended church services more openly than before, and keen listeners tuned to shortwave radios to pick up foreign broadcasts on crackling shortwave waves. Yet serious dissent remained dangerous. Disillusioned writers who stepped too far, or underground protesters, still faced persecution. Life took on a slightly more relaxed tone, but fear never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union raced into space, which was a great source of pride. In October 1957, scientists in a remote launch facility successfully sent Sputnik, the first human-made satellite, into orbit. People all over the country listened on radio as families in Moscow celebrated this triumph. It was simple in design, just a metal sphere sending out beeps, but to the world it was a revelation. A year later, in 1958, a stray dog named Laika became the first living creature to travel around the Earth. A test run that proved human spaceflight was possible, and on April 12, 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to orbit our planet and return safely. The nation erupted in joy and pride. Students skipped classes to watch the news, and children dreamed of becoming cosmonauts themselves. Cosmonauts like Gagarin became national heroes, visiting factories and schools to inspire people. This space triumph was said to prove that Soviet science was unmatched. In classrooms hung new posters of rockets, and on street corners young people closed their eyes, imagining the stars under a friendly red flag. However, tensions in Europe soon showed that the Cold War was far from over. In August 1961, East German and Soviet authorities suddenly closed the border through Berlin. Concrete walls and guard towers appeared overnight, and barbed wire fences sealed the streets. Families on both sides were cut off from one another. The Soviet press described the Berlin Wall as a protective barrier to keep out fascists and spies. And for many Soviet people, the wall was a somber symbol of the entrenched enmity between the two systems. The world had indeed become divided. Still, official media insisted it was necessary to defend socialism. The building of the wall led each side to live permanently on guard. In Moscow, children were told the wall would prevent another war. In West Berlin, families cried quietly as their loved ones were trapped forever behind the concrete frontier. In October 1962, the world held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba, a small Caribbean nation, had become a Soviet ally after Fidel Castro's revolution. To protect Cuba and to respond to American missiles in Turkey, Khrushchev secretly sent Soviet nuclear missiles to the island. When U.S. spy planes discovered the missile bases, President Kennedy announced a naval blockade of Cuba. In the Soviet Union, news coverage was controlled. People heard that American warships were blockading the island. Crowds gathered at newspapers, kiosks, reading Khrushchev's statements. After 13 tense days, Khrushchev agreed to dismantle the missiles in Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba, and secretly the removal of American missiles in Turkey. In the USSR, the official line praised Khrushchev for protecting Cuba and forcing the Americans to back down. Newspapers and radio declared it a triumph. Our courage secured peace. The crisis reminded everyone how close the world had come to nuclear war. Soviet people felt a mix of fear and pride in their leaders' handling of it. Fear that nuclear confrontation was possible, pride that the Soviet Union had stood its ground. At home, the late 1950s and early 1960s saw some modest improvements in daily life. Household production expanded. Many families now owned a black and white television or a refrigerator. By 1962, about half of all families had at least one TV set, and a new broadcast station in Moscow sent signals across the country. Even in collective farm villages, people gathered at the local center on weekends to watch educational programs or bulletins about space missions and farm yields. all education remained free, and by the mid-1960s, nearly every child completed secondary school, and many continued to universities or technical institutes. These schools produced a generation of engineers, scientists, and teachers eager to build communism. The government also emphasized the well-being of mothers and children. Maternity leave was extended, and child care centers were opened in cities. Young people joined pioneer clubs or the Komsomol Youth League, proudly marching in parades on Soviet holidays. On May Day and the October Revolution anniversary, children waved tiny Soviet flags beside adults. The state tried to provide for basic needs. Public health care and pensions for the elderly were promised by the party. Even so, shortages persisted. Stores often had empty shelves for fashionable goods. Basic foods like bread and potatoes were generally available, but delicacies like butter, meat, or fruit often disappeared for weeks, especially toward month's end. Shop queues of tired workers waiting for common staples were an everyday sight. People coped in various ways, growing vegetables in backyard gardens, raising chickens at the dacha, trading goods with neighbors or on informal street markets. Despite these shortages, many families felt secure. Housing construction continued, and most had electricity and running water for the first time in history. Khrushchev's brash style and reforms also bred unease within the ruling class. Some party elders found his behavior erratic and embarrassing. For example, he once boasted at the United Nations that we will bury you in ideological competition, and he famously pounded the table with his shoe at a UN assembly, a story later reported abroad. By 1964, even those who once supported him felt frustrated. His policies had upset entrenched interests. He had reduced military budgets and closed some Stalin-era penal camps, which angered conservatives, while his attempts to decentralize farming and the Virgin Lands campaign, trying to farm new areas in Kazakhstan and Siberia, led to mixed results and angered other sectors. Privately, many leaders feared Khrushchev's gambles. They believed they needed someone more predictable. Quietly, a consensus formed to remove him. In October 1964, after Khrushchev had returned from a vacation, Politburo members summoned him to a meeting and announced his resignation. For the first time, Soviet television announced a change of leaders by showing images of party officials passing a microphone in a kind of curtain call. The public announcement cited Khrushchev's advanced age and health reasons as cause, and he smiled as he left, saying he would go tend his garden. Life for ordinary people seemed to go on without interruption. Nikita Khrushchev was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, a veteran of the Seas Revolution. The new leadership emphasized steady progress. For most citizens, this change was barely noticed at first. Khrushchev's era of surprises had ended, replaced by a more predictable, if less dynamic, leadership. Leonid Brezhnev's long years at the helm in 1964 to 1982 were marked by two contrasting threads. On one hand, the Soviet state emphasized stability and the virtues of its socialist system. On the other hand, the Cold War continued to simmer with new tensions and rivalries abroad. Under Brezhnev, the Politburo took a cautious stance toward the world. The doctrine of developed socialism emerged as the official narrative. Soviet living standards were declared to have reached the level of prosperous Western nations. In practice, this meant that the leadership stressed how housing construction had risen, how healthcare and education were guaranteed, and how Soviet technology was advanced in many fields. The old slogan, "We live better than 50 years ago," was often repeated. At the same time, the Soviet Union continued to maintain its Warsaw Pact alliance, formed in 1955, conducting joint military exercises with its Eastern European allies. Every year, Warsaw Pact armies held maneuvers near the frontiers, reinforcing the image that the Soviet Union was the strong core of this socialist defense. In 1968, for example, when a reformist movement took hold in Czechoslovakia, the Soviet leadership acted quickly. Czechoslovakia's leaders had tried to liberalize their country and leave the Warsaw Pact, sparking the Prague Spring. Khrushchev had left power, but Brezhnev remained cautious of any breakaway. In August 1968, Soviet tanks and troops entered Czechoslovakia to suppress the reforms. Newspapers in Moscow described it as an action to restore order and protect socialism from dangerous elements. Czech churches were closed, and independent candidates were forced out. For the Soviet people, this showed that the Brezhnev government believed in firmly controlling its sphere. Socialism is one and indivisible, claimed Brezhnev in a later doctrine, justifying the intervention. At home, citizens observed the swift move with little public comment. It was treated as necessary. In Indochina, Americans were fighting in Vietnam throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Soviet Union saw the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, as part of the same global contest. Soviet ships and planes quietly delivered weapons, food, and supplies to North Vietnam, and military advisors were sent to train North Vietnamese pilots and tank crews. For Soviets, helping Vietnam was portrayed as an act of international solidarity, supporting a brother country in its struggle against American imperialism. When Saigon eventually fell to the Communists in 1975, Moscow celebrated. The victory was framed as vindication for the policy of global support. Soviet leaders hailed the Vietnamese as our comrades who had freed themselves from imperialist chains. Telegraph and radio relayed words of praise between Hanoi and Moscow. This event was held up as proof that socialism could succeed across the world, boosting national pride. Relations with the West took a turn in the 1970s toward détente, a period of eased tensions. Brezhnev and U.S. President Richard Nixon announced a new chapter of peaceful competition. In 1972, the two signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, freezing the number of long-range missiles. Soviets pointed to SALT I as evidence that the U.S. finally recognized the Soviet nuclear deterrent as equal. Later, in 1975, Soviet diplomats joined the Helsinki Accords, an international agreement in Europe on respecting borders and human rights. Many Soviet citizens were curious about these Western negotiations. Newsreels and radio programs presented them as steps toward reducing confrontation. Alongside this, the Soviet military still expanded its arsenal. Air defenses and intercontinental missiles grew in numbers. In 1969, A brief border clash with China in a remote river area underscored a new reality. Mao's China had drifted apart from Moscow and even become a rival power. The Soviets reacted by reinforcing their Far East defenses and deploying additional troops along the border. This showed that the Soviet Union now considered itself the uncontested leader of international socialism, no longer brothering China, but facing it as a possible challenger. Inside the Soviet Union, daily life under Brezhnev was often predictable. The state guaranteed employment for virtually everyone. Unemployment simply did not exist. Factories and mines ran steadily, even if efficiency lagged. Basic needs like housing, education, and healthcare continued to be provided by the state. By the mid-1970s, many people lived in small apartments in high-rise concrete buildings known as Khrushchevkas and Brezhnevkas. These blocks had been built to ease the chronic shortage of homes. In cities, paved roads and public transportation expanded, so workers and students traveled freely to factories, farms, and universities. The government liked to boast that we build communism by housing our people, and indeed, many families felt grateful to have their own private apartment after years of communal living. Culturally, the Brezhnev era was mixed. The state kept a firm hand on art and media, but certain types of expression flourished. War films, space race documentaries, and patriotic plays were popular and widely shown. Soviet ballet and classical music tours, such as the Bolshoi Ballet and the Moscow State Symphony, toured abroad as showcases of national greatness. Meanwhile, Soviet literature produced new poets and novelists who described daily life, though open criticism of the system was censored. Popular music included state-approved songs and jazz ensembles. Foreign rock music remained underground. Many young people privately bought Beatles records on bootleg vinyl, but would never admit it publicly. Mass events like sports competitions were major entertainment. Each Soviet triumph in an Olympic Games or a chess championship was celebrated as a victory for socialism. For example, Soviet athletes winning gymnastics or ice hockey golds in the Olympics were hailed in newspapers as proof of the system's strength. Science achievements, like launching more satellites or building nuclear plants, were also presented as national heroes. School kids studied all these in propaganda posters and textbooks, reinforcing a sense that any Soviet achievement was due to the superiority of socialist society. However, by the 1970s, the economy began to show signs of strain. Industrial growth had slowed from its wartime pace. Many factories still used equipment that dated back decades, and it was getting worn out. Workers sometimes joked that a factory line would stall, or that tractors in the fields broke down too often. Basic goods were guaranteed, but luxuries remained hard to find. Shops had a constant rotation of shortages. One week there might be plenty of soup cans and nothing else. The next week, flour might vanish. Fresh fruit and dairy were often imported in limited quantities and disappeared quickly. People endured these shortages patiently. Most households still had enough staples to get by, and the state periodically organized special sales to distribute hard-to-get items. Despite these frustrations, most families trusted that the government would provide stability and their basic needs. They compared their lives to stories of the desperate 1930s or the chaos of the Civil War, believing they were better off now. Conversations on street corners or in communal kitchens often revolved around gossip of who was on the party list for a coveted dacha or how children were doing in their technical institutes. But explicit criticism of the leadership was avoided in public. The Soviet Union's global influence also grew in small ways outside Europe and Asia. It provided advisors and equipment to friendly African and Middle Eastern countries. In 1973 and 1974, during the Middle East wars, Soviet tank crews even went to Egypt. Soviet and American forces occupied Egypt's Sinai briefly to separate Egyptian and Israeli armies, fulfilling treaty obligations and showing Soviet commitment to its allies. These moves were portrayed in Soviet media as bringing peace. The USSR claimed to be a mediator, helping to end conflicts. In the Soviet press, friendly leaders of Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, where Soviet aid supported socialist governments, were shown visiting Moscow wearing traditional dress in front of Lenin's statue. These events fed a narrative that the USSR was a pillar of world stability. Soviet television often showed smiling foreign officials thanking Moscow for hospitals or railroads built, suggesting that the socialist world was uniting in progress. In December 1979, the Soviet Union faced a difficult decision in Central Asia. Communist Afghanistan, a neighboring country, was plunged into a violent civil conflict, and its government asked for help. Leaders in the Kremlin feared that if Afghanistan fell to anti-Soviet forces, the southern flank of the Soviet Union could be threatened. After debating for months, Brezhnev gave the order. Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, officially to support the socialist government there. On television, this was announced as a necessary and limited brotherly intervention to defend socialism. At first, the event gave a boost to patriotic spirits. Families of the soldiers were assured of support from the state. However, once troops marched into the rugged mountains and faced fierce resistance, the war became a long and costly struggle. Soviet newspapers rarely showed images from Afghanistan. Instead, they ran stories of heroism in abstract terms. Soldiers were told they were fighting jihadis in a distant region. In reality, the Afghan war began to strain the Soviet economy and weigh on public morale. Young men's letters home became less frequent, and talk of the war was hushed. By the early 1980s, many Soviet citizens were quietly uneasy about the conflict, even if they did not openly speak against it. By the end of the 1970s, some Soviet citizens had begun to see the renewed tensions with the West. U.S. President Jimmy Carter delivered harsh speeches in 1977 denouncing the invasion of Afghanistan. In 1980, Carter announced a boycott of the Moscow Olympics to protest the war. Many Soviet people were disappointed by the boycott. Athletes had trained for years only to have their stage suddenly reduced. The state framed the boycott as a political insult by the West and responded with its own boycott of the 1984 Los Angeles Games. Despite this, the 1980 Moscow Olympics went on, and Soviet athletes won many medals, filling papers and TV with stories of victory and unity. Everywhere on Red Square and city parks, crowds cheered at the televised events. Throughout the Brezhnev years, there was a growing sense that society had a comfortable routine. The young did not remember anything but the settled Soviet state. Parents often recalled the revolution and war when they spoke to children, but kids themselves had only heard stories of hardship. Many joked that in the USSR, you'll never starve, but you will often stand in line. Still, some began to whisper complaints. A dissident poet might lament censorship in a quiet circle of friends. An engineer might jokingly curse bureaucracy after missing a promotion. But such criticisms were usually mumbled privately. On the surface, people attended May Day parades in warm jackets. Winter coats were plentiful for May 1st celebrations, listened to patriotic speeches, and went home to watch films about space or war on television. The Communist Party presented this steady life as progress toward communism. Each decade seemed better than the last in official accounts. But behind closed doors, an undercurrent of fatigue was growing. Factories that once glowed with activity sometimes fell silent. Students in dormitories read banned novels by flickering candlelight when electricity cuts came. The contrast between public pride and private doubt gradually widened, though few dared to acknowledge it openly. By the time of Brezhnev's death in 1982, the Soviet Union had become a global superpower, second only to the United States in military might and nuclear stockpile. The leadership in the Kremlin believed that their system had proven itself. The nation stood undefeated, having weathered wars and crises. State media insisted the country was more secure and prestigious than ever. Yet inside, a tired feeling was seeping in. Brezhnev's later years in power saw more ceremonies and fewer changes. The leadership became known as the gerontocracy, since many Politburo members were elderly. People rarely protested in the streets. The society was stable, if not dynamic. By 1982, long lines were still common for certain goods, and prices at stores remained too high for many. Still, pensioners remembered telling grandchildren about wartime rations and found that they now had full bellies and full pensions, though small. The Soviet people maintained a quiet hope that the system was strong, even as a sense of stagnation set in. The end of the Brezhnev era closed a chapter that had seen great victories abroad and growing challenges at home. In November 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died. The country mourned, but quietly wondered what would come next. The following years saw two more short-lived leaders. Yuri Andropov, who had spent decades as the head of the secret police, KGB, took power in 1982. He spoke of fighting corruption and improving the economy, but he himself was already ill. In 1984, he died and was succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko, a loyal party elder who had little energy for change. When Chernenko passed away in early 1985, another new face appeared at the Kremlin podium, Mikhail Gorbachev, just 54 years old, younger than most Soviet leaders since Stalin. Gorbachev was charismatic and spoke openly of reform. People said a new breeze was blowing in Soviet politics. Early in Gorbachev's term, two events showed how strongly things had shifted. First, in April 1986, the government for the first time publicly reported on the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. A reactor had exploded in Ukraine, and radiation had spread over the Western Soviet Union and beyond. The state had tried to keep it secret initially, but when clouds drifted over Europe, Moscow had no choice but to acknowledge the accident. For the first time, a Soviet tragedy was admitted broadly in the media. Citizens felt unsettled by the accident and frustrated by the earlier secrecy, but many also took courage from this openness. Gorbachev's administration began to promise more honesty with the public. Next, Gorbachev announced that the Soviet Union would withdraw its troops from the long war in Afghanistan. By 1989, Soviet soldiers had left the mountains and returned home after nearly a decade of fighting. Gorbachev explained that the conflict was ending, signaling that Soviet foreign policy would change. Abroad, Gorbachev extended this new tone to the rest of the world. In meetings with U.S. President Ronald Reagan, once a fierce anti-communist, Gorbachev acted warmly and practically. They negotiated the historic Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, agreeing to eliminate entire classes of missiles that had terrorized Europe. For the first time in decades, Soviet and American leaders dismantled weapons in each other's presence. The years 1987 to 1988 saw the number of Soviet tanks in Europe actually decrease. Soviet and American leaders began to negotiate further disarmament. Many Soviet citizens watched these developments with cautious hope, feeling that the risk of a global nuclear war might finally be diminishing. For example, in 1987 on Soviet television, Gorbachev shook hands with Reagan on the White House lawn in a scene that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. Yet back home, perestroika, Gorbachev's economic restructuring, revealed how deep the problems were. Factories that had struggled for years began reporting more breakdowns. Managers confessed that they could no longer meet quotas under the old system. By the late 1980s, shortages returned in some places. Empty shelves reappeared for pasta or oil. People feared for their jobs as state factories slowed down. In stores, lines of shoppers returned, this time for currency exchanges and consumer goods. Inflation began to appear. Some pensioners worried that their savings in rubles were losing value. The planned economy was unraveling, even as nobody fully knew what would replace it. Gorbachev admitted that the system had been ailing, and he asked workers to be patient as reforms took root. On radio and TV, appeals went out to sacrifice short-term comforts for long-term change. It was a confusing time. Officials spoke of a coming abundance under communism, even as carts were once again locked. Meanwhile, the winds of change blew through the Soviet bloc. Eastern European countries that had been Soviet allies all experienced their own versions of unrest. Each Soviet ally had a communist party and a single-party system modeled after Moscow. But in 1989, that model began to break. Popular movements demanded reforms, sometimes not quietly. In Poland, workers led by a man named Lech Wałęsa formed Solidarity, the first independent trade union in the Soviet orbit. After massive strikes in 1980, the government in Warsaw was forced to legalize solidarity. Martial law was imposed for a while, but Gorbachev made it clear that Moscow would not intervene to prop up the old guard. Encouraged, Poles negotiated an agreement. In 1989, Solidarity won most, of the contested seats in parliament in semi-free elections. Communist leaders quietly stepped aside and a non-communist prime minister took office. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the people saw this and were inspired. In May 1989, Hungary opened its border with Austria. East Germans queued to cross into Hungary and then to Austria, and from there to West Germany. In November 1989, massive protests in East Germany and a relaxation of travel restrictions led to the Berlin Wall being opened. Families reunited, and neighbors exchanged hugs across the former wall. When the wall came down on November 9th, 1989, it was a moment of jubilation that the Soviet people witnessed on television. Crowds tore down the concrete and barbed wire themselves. In Moscow, newspapers showed images of jubilant crowds in Berlin. Many Soviet citizens felt a mix of emotions. Some were happy that Berliners could be free and reunite with relatives. Others felt anxiety about what it meant for world order. Gorbachev told the nation on the evening news that this was a peaceful development and that the USSR felt no threat from it. He explained that the peoples of Eastern Europe had chosen their paths. Soon after, Gorbachev removed from the Soviet Constitution the clause that had given the Communist Party a monopoly on power, saying that the Soviet people could now run their affairs more freely. By the summer of 1990, republics within the Soviet Union itself were beginning to demand more autonomy. Baltic republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia declared themselves sovereign. Gorbachev had always spoken of forming a new union in which republics would have more self-governing authority, but now some republic leaders aimed for full independence. The old Soviet Union felt strange to many. On one hand, citizens celebrated the new freedoms. Independent newspapers started publishing. For instance, Muscovites could read a former dissident's magazine freely on newsstands. Independent. Churches reopened and people openly practiced religion after decades of state atheism. Private businesses, once unthinkable, began to appear. Streets in big cities gained small restaurants and shops, often run by cooperative enterprises. People tried entrepreneurship. There were now private farms, repair shops, travel agencies. But on the other hand, the economy was faltering. Shortages worsened, wages stagnated, and prices began to jump. Grocery shelves sometimes were empty of essentials. Many families feared unemployment as state plants shut or cut staff. People had grown accustomed to the certainty of guaranteed jobs. This new reality was unsettling. The year 1991 was turbulent and confusing. In August, a group of hardline communist leaders in Moscow attempted a coup, seizing power while Gorbachev was on vacation in Crimea. Tanks rolled into Red Square, and state television announced that Gorbachev was under house arrest. For a few tense days, it seemed the old order might clamp back down. But in Moscow, citizens spontaneously went out into the streets to resist the coup. Boris Yeltsin, then leader of the Russian Republic, climbed atop a tank and rallied the crowd to defend democracy. The coup collapsed after 3 days as tanks left the streets. All of this shook the nation. During the crisis, Soviets saw that hundreds of their leaders were no longer invincible. It was revealed that many of the old guard were willing to silence dissent with force. People grew wary of any return to centralized terror. After the failed coup, independence movements accelerated. By the end of 1991, the Soviet Union had effectively shattered. On December 25th, Mikhail Gorbachev announced he was resigning as president of the USSR. In Moscow's Red Square, the Soviet flag was lowered and replaced with the Russian tricolor. The next day, the Soviet Union simply ceased to exist as a single state. In its place were 15 independent republics, each choosing its own course. For many Soviet citizens, this ending was hard to grasp. A chapter begun in the defense and glory of socialism quietly closed without a bang. The ideology of communism and the superpower rivalry were now stories of history. Some people felt loss and nostalgia, remembering the pride of victory in World War II and the might of the Soviet era. Older people who had only known the USSR sometimes felt like orphans and in a strange new world. Others looked forward with hope, dreaming of free travel abroad and personal enterprise. In any case, the Cold War had ended from the Soviet perspective, not with triumph or direct confrontation, but with an unexpectedly gentle resolution. The walls between East and West had fallen, and the Soviet Union itself had quietly unfolded into new nations. Throughout these decades, life for ordinary people in the USSR had many rhythms. Children learned about their country's role in world events in school, the curriculum shifting with each leader's emphasis. Family. Dinners often featured stories of the war or tales of a faraway brother fighting in Korea or Afghanistan. In cities, people took pride in daily achievements. The doctor delivering a healthy baby at a clinic, the engineer building a new power station, the cosmonaut sending postcards from space. Cultural life continued. Soviet films and books were popular pastimes, and many enjoyed traditional folk music or ballet performances on state-sponsored television. Folk festivals and poetry readings were quietly held in community centers, and in winter, families gathered around the radio for operas or orchestras. People took weekend trips to the countryside's state-run sanatoria or to dachas outside the city, picking berries and mushrooms as a modest pleasure. In sports, children often practiced soccer or hockey on frozen ponds. School teams competed in everything from gymnastics to chess. The love of sport and culture was one way Soviet citizens felt connected to something larger. In the Cold War years from 1945 to 1991 formed the background for a generation's life in the Soviet Union. It was a time when leaders rose and fell, when nuclear weapons cast long shadows, and when people quietly adjusted to each new phase. The full story of those times, told calmly and fully, is not of warlike struggle at home, but of a superpower grappling with its ideals and realities. It was a period of both pride and uncertainty, of official triumphs and private doubts. Yet through it all, daily life continued, shaped by the grand events and turning on traditions both old and new. The Soviet perspective saw itself as defending the future of socialism while ensuring its people had a roof over their heads. By the early 1990s, that system would change forever, leaving behind a complex legacy that its people continue to remember with both affection and reflection.